all across the country, as Duke did right through Cincinnati neighborhoods against the will of residents. These pipelines have, of course, become the epicenter of environmental and civil rights battles. And then finally, a mayor of Loveland decides to build a parking garage that cuts right into the banks of the Obannon Creek with no public input, no environmental impact study, even though this is a floodplain. But we have just discovered that there may be a burial mound, and just look at that slide right to your right there. There's the Obannon Creek, and it's shored up with big boulders, but at the top of that hill there, that's where they want to build a parking garage. But there may be a burial mound right there on that site, thanks to Beth Sullebacher's report as a historic preservationist. So we may be able to stop this project in its tracks with the help of our Native people. So our panelists tonight will explain why today's environmental laws alone will not protect our world's ecosystem. And as they speak, you're all invited to put your questions into the chat, and we will address them during the last half hour of the program. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Susan Blondahar is a member of CROW, that is Citizens for Rights of the Ohio River Watershed, as you see. And she's a one-time contractor with the US EPA. Tish Odell is Ohio organizer with CELDEF, that is Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Tish has been mentoring CROW and helping us develop a Bill of Rights as a legal strategy for protecting our watershed ecosystem. And then Jerry Neri, a friend of CROW, is executive director of the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition. Bill Cahalan, finally, is a member of CROW, and he's an eco-psychologist and a longtime environmental activist. So now, Bill, I was wondering if you could begin our program with a land acknowledgement. Maybe explain what it is.
Yes, well, a lot of groups have been doing land acknowledgements lately, and CROW always begins with one, and it's just a reminder to us in the meetings that the land we're on is sacred, and that the people—
No, there's 37 people on it.
Some other voices coming in. I don't know where that
Sorry.
is coming from.
Go ahead.
Anyway,
Everybody please mute except the speaker.
so a land acknowledgement is just a reminder to us in the meeting of the fact that we're on sacred land that was from which its original protectors were removed by European Americans. It's just a kind of a meditation and reminder to ourselves about that. So this is one of the acknowledgements we sometimes read. We acknowledge with gratitude that we gather today in the Central Ohio River watershed in the traditional homelands of the Shawnee, the Miami, and also the Ottawa, the Wyandot, Delaware, Iroquois, as well as other indigenous nations. Our region was impacted by the 1795 so-called Treaty of Greenville, when tribes were manipulated to surrender claims to their land. With Western expansionism, all tribes were then officially removed from Ohio in the mid-1800s to places like Kansas and Oklahoma. While currently there are no federally recognized tribal communities or nations in our state, our region is home to many Native people from across Turtle Island who have been impacted by the legacy of colonial policies, broken treaties, and genocide, but still remain committed to indigenous sovereignty. We honor them and we honor their reverence for these lands as we stand committed to be partners in healing and restorative justice.
Thank you, Bill. That's beautiful. So tonight, what we're going to be talking about is the failure of our government to protect our rights to clean water and a healthy environment. So this failure has been called the regulatory fallacy. And Susan Blondahar is going to help explain what that concept is all about.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And I'm very grateful to Woman City Club for this opportunity and very honored to be among the panelists with my esteemed colleagues this evening. So yeah, it's Earth Day, huh? Once again, I remember the first Earth Day. I was 8 years old and the message rang loud and clear to me, and it began a lifelong environmental activism on my part, advocacy. And I studied environmental science. I have a master's degree. I worked as a research scientist, a project scientist at the US EPA here in Cincinnati for 25 years. And I was surrounded by very intelligent, dedicated, innovative people. We did great work. And as time went on, I just kept getting this nagging feeling that something's wrong. What is missing here? Where are the captains of industry that are supposed to come and get these best practices and this, best available technology that we were developing? There was always this disconnect, it seemed. And the frustration just grew stronger. I'm sure anyone can speak about the inefficiencies of a major organization, so we could speak at length with that, but I just became increasingly frustrated with it, and I had an opportunity for early retirement, and I just began teaching environmental science at area colleges, and I felt like in 3 months' time of teaching, I had done more to help the environment than I did in 25 years of research, which is kind of speaks volumes there. But within a few years of my teaching, I started hearing the message coming from CELDEF, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund that Tish is here tonight to speak from. And this message that, the laws and regulations of our system are actually designed to allow pollution. That's how they were designed, that they're not working. They're working very well to continue industry, enabling them to pollute. And that's the regulatory fallacy. And I would like to jump back to the screen share here and show some slides that illustrate this point. So yeah, here we are, 50 years since Earth Day, right? And by almost every major environmental statistic, things are worse now than they were in the 70s. Some things are better. The bald eagle is off the endangered species list, but we're facing mass extinction. The ozone kind of healed up a little bit, but now we have climate change. Things are really worse. And what has not happened? And this slide kind of gets into the crux of it. And if you just take a few moments to look at these regulatory agencies, I encourage you to go to their websites and look at them and try to get a sense of what the intention is of these organizations just by looking at their information. And you see this beautiful logo, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. That's the big law, the federal law, the Clean Water Act, right? You need your permit. You need your NPDES permit. It's your permit for clean water. It's your permit for dumping pollution. The discharge elimination isn't eliminating discharge, it's eliminating pollution from the site of the polluter. And there are 40,000 active discharge permits on the Ohio River at this time. And a stated goal of the Clean Water Act was zero discharge by 1985. So if we had a serious intention to have zero discharge, 30, 40 years ago, that's what we would have. There is no limit to the number of permits that are issued. The hearing process for communities is required, but there's no mandate that the agencies heed the public comment. The Toxic Substance Control Act, which is another, act of the Environmental Protection Agency and Congress, essentially voluntary, unless these agencies, the polluters are forced to Okay, so we had this pollution prevention program at the EPA, and these audits were voluntary. The industry had to request you to come and then this wonderful auditor would come and give you all these innovative, great ideas about your pollution prevention. Another thing that we don't have in the United States, and we really missed the boat, in 2006, the European Union passed the precautionary rule that chemicals are guilty until they're proven innocent, that an industry has to prove that chemicals are safe. We do not have that here. And, so we ban C8, we ban PFOA. Well, here comes Gen X. It's C6, so it's got a shorter half-life, but it's still a forever chemical. And this goes on and on. We have thousands of new chemicals on the market every year in our water, our air, our clothing. So anyway, I just want to move to this slide. I know you can't see much on it, but this is the permits and license page of the Ohio EPA. What do you think? Rubber stamps, anyone? You think they're in the business of approving your permit? They certainly are. Here's a quote right from the Ohio EPA website. Frequently asked question, is it legal to have wastewater coming out of a pipe into my local water? The short answer is yes, as long as the wastewater is covered by a permit. And they assure us there's enough controls to make sure that raw sewage being dumped in our lakes and rivers is just fine, as long as they got a permit. That's it. If it's permitted, it's legal. Now, don't get me wrong, compliance, this process is expensive. It's an entire industry. It's very complicated. It takes forever to, you need a whole industry of people and professionals to write these applications. There's very specific reporting of sample collection software. There's non-compliance fees as well as approval fees. So it's an arduous process, but as long as the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, pollution is permitted. That's what the system does. That's the regulatory fallacy. And there is one of the sides of the box that perhaps Tish will talk more about. Jean has already talked about state preemption boxing us in. We know that we have a cultural belief that nature is property. And of course, there's the corporate privilege, the years of legal precedents and the financial support behind corporations to be able to go to court and defend themselves, where there is no defense for Mother Nature. There is no defense for ecosystems. There is no legal standing in court. So I'm going to conclude my portion with a little video here from CELDEF and their beautiful Fast Facts Friday. And I don't know why I can't get out of the screen. Why can't?
Hello and welcome to our next community suggested topic here on Fast Fact Friday.
Okay, I'm trying to, there we go. If I don't,
Hello and welcome to our next community suggested topic here on Fast Fact Friday. We are the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and we are answering your questions. Today, we're going over the regulatory fallacy. Last week, we touched on the regulatory fallacy, but viewers wanted a deeper dive. So today, we're here asking, is it really illegal to think outside of the box? What is it that keeps us from protecting our communities? Why aren't we allowed to say no when a corporation wants to come in and drill, dump, or destroy? The short answer, the law. A handful of legal doctrines make it illegal for communities to govern on important issues like fracking, factory farms, large-scale infrastructure projects, and commercial water extraction. Many people work hard to create sustainable communities, but these legal doctrines keep us running around in circles. The system of law that is currently in place routinely restricts local lawmaking and pushes back against communities who try to make things safer for its residents. Let's use the issue of fracking, but really you can insert any issue your community faces here. We're going to use it to talk about how these legal doctrines prevent you from acting and protect the industry from citizen opposition. The permitting process and the regulatory laws supposedly enforced by regulatory agencies are often intended to create a sense of protection and objective oversight. We're encouraged to come to the hearing at 7 p.m. if we're opposed to the fracking, but no one bothers to tell us that no matter how harmful fracking is, municipalities cannot ban anything permitted by the state. We sit there and wait our turn. They call our name, and then we present our 3-minute impassioned speech about the risk to community health and community well-being. But in the end, nothing we say is taken into account by the agency when they make the decision to issue the permit. If the application is in order and complete, the permit is issued by the agency. The harms are then legalized. The permitting agency is business to facilitate the issuance of the permit, not to protect people or the ecosystem. The idea that regulations protect us is a fallacy. By their very definition, they permit harm, and we are taught that our best option is to regulate just how much harm we are required to accept. You might argue, but zoning lets us stop harms, right? Well, not really. Zoning allows us, in most cases, to decide where the industrial damage can occur. In other words, we get to choose which part of our community we want sacrificed to harmful corporate activity. And in most cases, those in a lower socioeconomic status take the brunt of the harm, which often leads to environmental injustice. While our legal system creates the illusion that we have a democracy, the regulatory fallacy is part of a system that helps to funnel us into a trap where we're told when it comes down to actual governing and creating sustainable communities that we are beyond our authority. But we're not. We are the authority. We have the power to demand change. So instead of allowing yourself to be regulated by this environmental protection fallacy, instead of losing your voice, going to hearing after hearing, instead of exhausting your resources, your energy, and your time, why not cut the cord and demand the change? Thanks for joining us for episode 6 of Fast Fact Friday. If you want more information on the regulatory fallacy, head over to celdef.org. And remember, if you have a suggested topic, go ahead and send us an email. Thanks for watching.
I don't know why I'm having such a hard time.
Thank you, Susan. That's beautiful. That really sums it up. Maybe we can move on to Tish. Tish, maybe you can explain what can we do differently?
Oh boy, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I only have 15 minutes, so I'll try.
Right.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Jean, and the Women's Tea Club, though, for inviting me this evening. And I want to start out by saying, what do the next 50 years look like for protecting ecosystems? And the reason I say the next 50 is because we've been using the environmental model of regulation and laws that Susan spoke of for around 50 years. And I think we can agree it's all been a failure based on what we see happening around us. So the question becomes, like you said, do we continue to follow this path, or do we try a new approach to protecting the environment? And we do have a choice, and we can evolve in our thinking and in our laws. And I don't know if it was mentioned or not, but CELDEF is a public interest nonprofit law firm. And we began over 25 years ago as a traditional environmental law firm. So trying to enforce these laws that Susan described. But after a few years of attempting to represent communities using these laws, and we won actually on the first go round. And so we had a really good record on paper, and we were considered one of the best environmental law firms in the nation. But we looked around at the communities and it didn't match. It didn't match up. The communities were being destroyed and having to take the harm and nature and the environment to what we were portrayed as on paper. So, we almost shut down, and we didn't want to do the work, the same kind of work that wasn't stopping the harm and destruction. And so that's when we began to change our thinking and looked at the problem and at the solutions in a different way. And we switched from operating under this belief that the system was broken and that if we just tweaked it a little bit, we could fix it. And what we decided, and when we looked at everything, is that we needed to break actually the system and create something new that would actually protect the environment. And just this simple shift in thinking changes your activism. So we need to break free from the constraints that stifle our imaginations to create something new, and a new way that actually does protect nature. And that's what led us to looking at rights of nature. And what do we mean? I guess I want to define that first when we say rights of nature, because a lot of people maybe have heard of it, but they don't know exactly what it means. And I would say today, the most widely accepted definition is the idea that ecosystems, bodies of water, forests, watersheds, all species of life have the right to exist, flourish, and thrive, similar to the concept of fundamental human rights, and that nature should be able to defend those rights in court. It means securing the highest legal protection and the highest societal value for nature through the recognition of nature's rights and the associated human rights. And just to give a real brief history, rights of nature in Western law and culture is a relatively new idea, but it isn't a new idea by any means. And I'm guessing our next speaker will fill you in on much of that in his talk. But this idea of rights is a Western non-Indigenous idea. And many of you may have read the book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. In that book, she talks about Indigenous culture looks at humans as being part of nature and not separate from nature, and that we're all related. So not just the humans, but to all of nature, we're related, and that we actually have responsibilities and obligations to nature. And if we try to view nature and the earth through that lens of being a relative, you wouldn't just use it and abuse it for your own benefit. I mean, when we look at our own relatives and friends and neighbors, we feel a sense of responsibility to take care of and nurture those people that we feel deeply connected to and love. Now, back to our Western culture, on the other hand, in our laws, we view nature as a commodity, and we view it as a resource to be used and exploited for purely, human benefit and gains. And so that's the paradigm shift that when we talk about rights of nature and that we have to change our way of thinking, it's about regarding our relationship to nature. And so where did our views on nature as property come from? And that's the side of the box when Susan put that up, that we view in our culture nature as property. And of course, it came from England. And we do a democracy school. We go into great detail talking about this. But just to say here that our founding fathers, they were the elite 1% of their day. And so they made sure when they wrote the Constitution, first and foremost, they protected their position, wealth, and power. And they accomplished this by crafting a Constitution that protected property above all else. And we know that they tied democracy to property. You had to have property to run for office, to hold office. You had to have property in order to vote. Well, this from the very beginning limited who could participate in decision-making. And they looked out and saw what was in front of them, and they just saw land full of resources for their gain and profit. And so these colonizers only saw dollar signs when they looked at nature. And if you want to learn more about this topic, I suggest reading Ben Price, who works also at CELDF. He wrote a book called How Wealth Rules the World, and that'll be put in chat for you. In Western law, the concept of rights of nature, though, back to our system of law, back to probably 1972. And some of you may have heard of Christopher Stone. He was a professor. He wrote an academic paper, Should Trees Have Standing? And it was pretty much just discussed in academic circles, although he did manage to get his paper to Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, who then cited it in his dissenting opinion in a case called Sierra Club versus Morton. So it lost, but it was the first time that rights of nature, that concept was actually mentioned in a legal decision. And then it just sat there. So from 1972, nothing really happened. And it sat there till 2006. So that's at the same time when CELDF was thinking about shutting down because we didn't want to continue that myth of that these environmental laws were actually protecting the environment. And through the process of trying to answer community members' questions, we rediscovered rights of nature in Christopher Stone's paper, and this community, we went to and said, do you want to try this? Maybe it'll work. So in 2006, the small rural community of Tamaqua Borough, which is in southeast Pennsylvania and very conservative, became the first place in the United States and actually in the world to recognize rights of nature law on white settler colonial land. And it wasn't challenged. So it just sat there on the books, dormant, kind of like Christopher Stone's manuscript. But this time, this one small act had a ripple effect to other places. And the news made it all the way to Ecuador. And in 2008, they took the same model that was used in Tamaqua and added it to their new constitution that they were drafting. And with that, the Ecuadorian constitution became the first constitution in the world that included rights for nature. So don't ever let others talk you out of what you know is right, because it goes against current laws and beliefs, because you don't know the greater impact that it may have down the road. I look at it as we're all planting seeds and we don't know where those seeds are going to drift to and where they're going to take hold and start sprouting. Now, I'm not saying that it's easy either by any means. And many communities here in Ohio and across the country have attempted rights of nature laws. And so far, we have seen tremendous pushback. Because even though the current laws and regulatory system are not working for the environment and many of the humans, and of course, all the other species of life, it's working really well for those that set the system up. So that elite 1% minority. And of course, they're going to fight any change to this system because it's been fixed to work in their favor of placing profits above people and nature. So that should be expected. We shouldn't be surprised. And the other thing I want you to think about is that our environmental laws and regulations actually separate and break apart the issues and the activists themselves. You know, this is how we wind up with one group trying to protect, let's say, Lake Erie from factory farming, and another group working to save a specific species of bird or fish in Lake Erie, another group concerned about the failing nuclear plant on Lake Erie's shore, another concerned about PCBs, another about open lake dumping, another about microbeads, and on we go. So we have to recognize that just as all the life in the Lake Erie ecosystem is connected, so are the problems. And so they fragment our activism, and in doing so, that dilutes our ability to make any meaningful change to a system that legalizes the pollution and harm. And we currently do have a system that makes it illegal to stop the contamination of water. And in order to change this, we are going to have to change our way of thinking and our cultural perspective, and then hopefully our laws on how we think of and interact with nature. We have to start realizing that we are part of nature, not separate and above nature, and that what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. We need to repair all the fragmenting and work together on strategies that protect entire ecosystems. And this is what the people who are working on rights of nature are attempting to do. The idea is that if the ecosystem, and let's say it's the Ohio River watershed, has legally recognized rights to exist, flourish, and thrive, then any harmful activity or project that is occurring or is proposed, an advocate for that ecosystem could bring a claim in court. Now remember, in our system, whoever has the most property usually has the most power and the loudest voice. And we see this over and over again in our elections, who can get laws passed because they can hire more lobbyists, who can fight in court longer, if at all, and it goes on and on. Also, in this country, we have been taught that private property rights supersede everything else. Now, I know when I say this, that this is part of the problem, that touches a nerve with a lot of people. But I'm talking about how we've been conditioned to only value property rights and never talk about community rights or nature's rights. And I've come to realize that so many of our issues and problems are because there are a lot of things that are out of balance. So I want you to just think about, does an individual's ownership of property give that person the right to harm the other humans and non-human life in the community? In our current system, the answer is most of the time, yes, it does. And the judges and the courts back this up because of the laws that we have in place on the books. Now, if we lived in a community, a state, or a country that both culturally and legally recognized rights of nature, the people could file a lawsuit on behalf of nature and the humans' rights that are being violated, as we now see happening in Ecuador, as there's cases there now regarding the Vilcabamba River. That was one they had a few years ago. And just this past December, the Los Cedros Forest case. And nature won in both those cases. Now, it doesn't mean that everything would be perfect and that nature would automatically win. But if you can't even make your case, in other words, even step into the courtroom, you know that the outcome is not going to be in your favor or in nature's favor. So this is about at least leveling the playing field somewhat. And to do this, we will also need to address corporate rights. So that was the other side of the box when Susan put that up. You know, most of us, I think, all understand that this idea of corporate personhood rights is a made-up legal construct, which for decades has been used against people and the environment. Corporations never had to circulate petitions, beg legislators, or march in the streets to obtain their rights. So when we talk about rights of nature, we have to be clear that just recognizing rights for nature alone is not enough. We have to be simultaneously working to also dismantle some of the horrible laws and precedent that are used as tools to keep destroying and exploiting nature for profits. So this means that if not abolishing corporate rights completely, at least curtailing and limiting the corporate form's power so that the people and nature rights take precedence in decision-making regarding projects and decisions that will impact nature and the people. And finally, I just want to touch on something else because it comes up a lot, and that's on political sustainability versus actual sustainability, which is really about shifting more public dollars to the corporate 1% while not touching on the root of the problem. And lately, there's been quite a few examples of this recently in the news related to the Great Lakes. And I'm actually, I don't know if people know, but I'm up in the Cleveland area. So Lake Erie is only 10 miles from me. So I am, you know, really attached to the Great Lakes, just like you guys are very attached to the Ohio River. But, you know, I wonder if it's a coincidence that a lot of this is happening right after an elected representative in New York State introduced the Great Lakes Bill of Rights. You know, I don't know if they're connected, but it might, feels like it might. And the first example is US Representative Marcy Kaptur. She put forward, she wants to establish a federal Great Lakes Authority to promote the region's environment and economy. The legislation would establish a new federal entity called the Great Lakes Authority that would promote regional economic development. Now, maybe they'll do something and propose something the same for the Ohio River, I don't know. But why is this worrisome? Well, what it's doing is shifting the power over decision-making up to the federal level, which is even further away from the people connected to the Great Lakes. And you have to remember the federal government sees the Great Lakes as a great resource that they want to control. We've already heard and seen articles written that there have been talks to plans to build a pipeline from the Great Lakes to the drought-stricken West. Do the people who depend on the Great Lakes, would they be in favor of this? But with that authority, they may not have any voice, which is what they're trying to do. Now, the second article that came out exactly the day after that article was that the Biden administration wants to invest in cleaning up the polluted Great Lakes. A $1 billion investment into the Great Lakes Basin via the bipartisan infrastructure law. Building a better America requires us to confront legacy pollution and clean up the environment, ensuring our kids drink clean water and creating good paying jobs in the process. Well, it sounds good. Sounds real good, doesn't it? Through the lens of the system we have right now. But let's look at the language through another more ecocentric lens. If we look at the Great Lakes as a whole ecosystem that is connected, does it make sense to put money into cleaning up one part of this ecosystem while continuing to issue more permits and approve projects that will simply harm the ecosystem in another place of the ecosystem? The point I'm making is that these two pieces of legislation, what they do is they shift public tax money to private corporations who will get the contracts to do the cleanup, but they don't actually stop continued harm to the lakes. So they keep the illusion alive that the government is protecting us in the environment, and yet the Great Lakes will continue to die and be harmed because more permits are being issued at the same time that they claim to be cleaning it up. So what's really changed? What I appreciate about, and it was Assemblyman Pat Burke in New York State, who we worked with to draft the Great Lakes Bill of Rights, he's evolved in his thinking, and he understood that even attempting to protect one of the Great Lakes, like Lake Erie, because he had already introduced that legislation a few years ago, and he evolved and said, that's not going to work because the lakes are all interconnected. If one is exploited to cause severe harm to a particular lake, it will affect all the others. And guess what? These man-made boundaries we create is not how nature works. We have to realize that everything we do impacts nature. So when the government says we are going to remediate a poisoned lake or an old factory site and clean it up, what does that really mean? Where is the waste going to go? Are we simply moving the problem from one community to the other? That's a lot, I know, for a short amount of time. And I think I'm going to stop here so that the next speaker has plenty of time to address all of you, and that there will be links to the resources. And the final thought I just want to leave you with is that rights of nature, in my mind, is not the end goal, but it can be a means to get us where we ultimately need to go. And I love to imagine a world where we all realize that we are nature and not above nature. And then if that happened, we would no longer need laws to stop us from poisoning ourselves. And with that, I'm going to turn the Zoom over to the Executive Director of the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition and Indigenous activist, Jerry Neary.
Good evening. How are you guys doing today? I am honored and humbled to be a part of this panel discussion today. Like they said, I am the Executive Director of the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition here in Cincinnati. And there are currently no recognized Native nations in the state of Ohio. All of those recognized tribes, the Shawnee and the Miami and another 50 nations that at one time or another called Ohio home, have been removed from this area. And it was a very systematic and brutal removal that took place through broken treaties and forced relocation. The reason I'm bringing this up is the Haudenosaunee, they used to call the river, they called the river Ohio, which meant good water. The Ohio River, prior to first contact for 14,000 years at least, was under indigenous native stewardship. As far back as they can tell, and as far back since time immemorial, within those stories that these people are telling, the people of these nations are telling, since time immemorial, they have been the stewards of the Ohio River. Within the period of time, within the period of 150 or so years, that these nations were finally removed from the Ohio River. The Ohio River has become one of the most polluted rivers in the United States. I think 14,000 years is a pretty good track record. Like Tish was talking about, when you have a relationship with the water, when you have a relationship with the land, when you are stewards, and the water, it's not that the water is a relative, it's that the water is a part of you, the same way the land is a part of you. And that relationship is that part, that relationship that those indigenous and native people have to the water. It's not a job. It's not that, people say, I'm going to be a Native American or indigenous activist and protect the water. That is who we are. That's the same as you would protect yourself, as you would protect you wouldn't poison yourself. You would make sure that whatever you are taking into yourself is protected. You would protect your family. That's a part of a balance. That's a part of a way of living your life. That is not only is it the natural, organic way in order to live and survive, it is just good management. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recognized that Indigenous rights and climate action are inherently intertwined. From fire management to forest stewardship, Indigenous peoples have over generations amassed critical knowledge about living and caring for ecosystems in a sustainable manner. It is no wonder that many consider land back a keystone of environmental justice. Land back is a movement that talks about returning the stewardships of the land and the water to these indigenous nations, these indigenous people. And the thing is, people don't want to acknowledge the fact that humans have played a role in landscape and water stewardship since time immemorial, and that humans and landscapes, they co-evolved. So for thousands and thousands of years, those indigenous people that were here, as they evolved, as they grew, that relationship that they had with the water and the landscape around the water, and the protection of the medicine in the water and the food supply, that worked in balance, in synchronicity. And that is important. We can't have government agencies and bureaucracy that's rubber stamping EPA
Regulations.
right. But to be able to just build petrochemical and ethane cracker plants on the Ohio River. I mean, when we look at the things that had happened up the Ohio River, when we talk about PTFE and DuPont and what it did to our neighbors in West Virginia, this is important because those forever plastics, they're passing that blood-brain barrier the same way that the PTFE is. And what this means, for the first time, they're finding microplastics in our DNA that has become a part of us. I have an organization that is from the Arctic Circle, the Tuktoyaktuk Youth, and they're tracing back these plastics that are turning up in the Arctic Circle, these forever plastics, and they're finding their origins to be in Ohio, in Cincinnati, off the Ohio River. So the things that we're developing, the plastics that we're making already on the Ohio River, are turning up in the Arctic Circle, are turning up in their food, are turning up in their fish. We have people that are in northern Canada that are growing medicines, and the waterways that feed their medicines that they grow, they're finding those plastics in them. They're traveling all over the world, and it's not big pieces of plastics. It's these microplastics that are traveling in the rain, in the weather, that are coming down in other places and poisoning other places. In 2019, the United Nations Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services found that environmental impacts were less severe or avoided altogether in areas held or managed by Indigenous peoples or local Indigenous communities. In Chicago in 1994, there was a heat wave this heat wave was so severe that almost 200 people died from it. And the people who were most affected from it were those Black and brown and poor communities that when they had the rolling brownouts, when they lost their electricity, when they didn't have, or if they didn't have adequate air conditioning or ventilation or even a fan, these elderly people who didn't have a lot of people to take care of them in the first place, who didn't have access to bottled water. These are the people who passed away from the heat. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because in Ohio, in Cincinnati, the amount of snowfall has gone down over the past few decades. Yet the amount of rain that we have has increased. So our precipitation has increased and our snowfall has decreased. That increased precipitation, that turns up in our waterways as agricultural and industrial runoff. That gets on our waterways, and then that ends up in the Ohio River. We've had our first algae bloom a couple of years ago on the Ohio River. A heat wave of the magnitude that happened in Chicago in 1994 is going to be the normal in Cincinnati from now on. It's not something that's going to happen in 10 years. It's not something that's around the corner. From now on, the heat, the amount of heat that we have in our city is going to be of that magnitude. So it's already here. So now we need to figure out ways that we can survive what is already happening with this climate change. We can't continue to allow these industries to build without any thought to what it's doing to the communities around us. Cincinnati will be adversely affected by this. Cincinnati gets its drinking water from the Ohio River, as Tish and as Susan were talking about with Arsenco and them rolling back the enforcement of the EPA regulations that were already laxing. This is something that is going to affect all of us in Cincinnati, specifically those Black and brown and indigenous communities. I am not saying that indigenous people or native people, that we have all of the answers. But when I look at things, and when people talk about I was laughing because Tish was talking about breaking the system to create something new and the rights of nature. And she did say something afterwards, this has always been, for 40,000 years, this has been a native belief. This has always been an indigenous belief, and the Smithsonian reported that in recent years, scientists' understanding of the Amazon rainforest has been increasingly informed by a body of research that suggests the landscape was actively, intensively shaped by indigenous peoples before the arrival of Europeans. Some studies ascribe the tree species that now dominate the forest of prehistoric human management and landscape engineering. Other work posits that when the colonizers from Europe caused massive losses to indigenous Amazonians with disease, slavery, and warfare, the sudden interruption in landscape scale manipulation resulted in so much forest regrowth that it caused a global drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide that brought about a climactic shift that is known as the Little Ice Age. The Amazon rainforest, the Amazon River, that was maintained by indigenous people for thousands of years that reshaped the way that forest behaved. They reshaped it in a way that it was in balance with the humans and the water and the forest. And they did it for thousands of years. We don't have all the answers. we can't, we can't fix everything, especially with the amount that's been damaged so far. But we can start changing. We can start changing our perspective. When we talk about something taking 50 years to do, in our way, they talk about 7 generations, and we can take those lessons from 3 generations before us and apply them to how they're going to affect the next 3 generations after us. And if it takes us 50 years, if it takes us 150 years, we're making a difference. We have to be able to start to make those changes, to start to set that table so that our children and our grandchildren will be able to do those things that maybe we won't accomplish in our lifetime, but we start that groundwork. We start creating those programs and that foundation so that 150 years from now, if we haven't destroyed ourselves, that our children and our grandchildren will be able to have that sustained clean drinking water and have a cleaner Ohio River.
Jerry, thank
Yes.
you. Thank you so much. We have so much to learn from you, and we should have a whole program on just what you have to share with us, because we do need to change our relationship with nature if we're going to save it. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. Bill, I just wonder if you have some time here to just talk a little bit about why some of us in this community are beginning to look at the rights of nature movement to see what we can do within that sphere to maybe make some changes in our Ohio River Valley. I think you're muted.
I'm assuming I still have my 10 minutes to talk about the 2 topics we
Sure.
planned, right?
Go ahead. All right.
And so the first thing I wanted to talk about is the basic shift in worldview that we're trying to invite people into in the rights of nature movement. It's an old and ancient worldview, but it's also in some ways new. And the second thing I wanted to talk about is just what Crow is and what Crow's been doing in the couple of years that we've existed. So the basic shift in worldview or paradigm shift. We're talking about a shift away from, and a lot of this incorporates and draws on what Jerry was saying, away from a view of Earth. And this view is common in our culture. It's part of the bedrock of this European American industrial consumerist culture. Earth seen as just a soulless, quote, environment outside of and beneath us, which is human property and must be managed, to a view of Earth as an alive, intelligent, sacred community, which we don't own, we belong to, and must be in conversation with, not just management of. So that's the basic shift we're talking about. And we realize what a big deal that is, how basic it is. It's everybody has a worldview. It's unconscious to most of us. It's never been verbalized for many of us, but it's there. And this illusion of separation from an environment outside of and beneath us is so basic to the fact that we're letting all this unraveling, this great unraveling, Joanna Macy calls it, of the Earth's life systems to take place in a relentless way. This old and new worldview and feeling for Earth as living and sacred has been influenced by 20th century scientific wisdom, as well as by the wisdom of indigenous people, especially Native American people. Stuart Chase was an economist and writer who wrote in 1940, 80 years ago, this little set of sentences that are illuminating to me. We are creatures of the earth and therefore a part of all the prairies, mountains, rivers, and clouds. Unless we feel this dependence. We may know all the calculus and all the Talmud, but have not learned the first lesson of living on this earth. And he said, unless we feel this dependence, we have not learned the first lesson of living on this earth. Not just know about the dependence, but feel it at the heart and gut level. So a major task of our CROW group, Citizens for Rights of Ohio River Watershed, of all people working toward ecological health, must be now, we feel, to tune in more deeply to the living world on a knowledge, but especially on a feeling level. Motivated then towards serving the living world more than just toward human survival. I believe that we are blocked from this deep change in worldview by our addictive attachment to the ease and supposed safety of functioning well within the technological bubble which we've now surrounded ourselves with. And we're so focused on being good consumers and owners and managers of the earth, seen as kind of an insentient and kind of a background resource base, that it's very hard for us to shift gears into this worldview, even though it can be very compelling to do so. How some of us are trying to regularly step beyond this techno bubble is another story that I don't have time to speak about now. It takes a regular practice, I think. Now I want to talk about CROW a little bit. In the fall of 2019, some of us in the eco neighborhood I live in on Enright Ridge and East Price Hill had a speaker series about the rights of nature. And one of them was Tish O'Dell in December 2019. And then we had two in the winter also, and running into January and February, two speakers, two more. I think Tish was live with us face to face. Everybody else was on Zoom, as I remember it. And then we started planning in 2020 to have a face-to-face democracy school sponsored by Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Well, we had to change that to an online school in August because of COVID coming in. And we had that online school, many people attended. 11 of us came out of that democracy school in September of 2020 and formed the CROW group. Some of what we've been doing is to develop a vision and mission statement, just to kind of get together, get to know each other, get our heads together in terms of what we wanted to be all about. We started developing a Bill of Rights for the Ohio River Watershed then, fall of 2020. The next summer had a booth last summer at Paddle Fest. And we had a big banner we developed. We developed this logo eventually that you're seeing here, have it on t-shirts. I think it's on the big banner. And then we developed a PowerPoint, some of the slides of which are in this, you're seeing today, and began giving it to people who would have us. I recently gave it at the Heritage Unitarian Church on the east side of Cincinnati. We've given it about 3 times. And if we count today, it's a 4th time. And we finally, for now, finalized our Bill of Rights. It's 9 pages. Part of it is kind of modeled on the Bill of Rights passed by 2/3 of the voters in Toledo in 2018 or 19, Tish? One of the two.
2019.
2019, 2/3 of the voters in Toledo voted in this Bill of Rights. They couldn't get the city council to put it on the ballot, so they had to do petitions and gather 10,000 signatures, which they did, to get it on the ballot. And that's kind of a world's first for a city electorate to vote in a Bill of Rights for an ecosystem. So that's where we are now. We're starting to show this Bill of Rights to various people. If you go to crowOhio.org, just CROWOHIO.org, you'll see the introductory page to it. And soon we'll put the whole thing up on the website. So that's kind of those are just some of the things we've been doing. We have subcommittees to contact churches. We have subcommittees for colleges, subcommittees for schools. And we're just trying to really get people familiar with this odd and unusual and radical concept of nature actually having rights equal to or greater than that of corporations. So with that's my little summary.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Bill. We also are trying to maybe invite more people to come, and we're going to be setting up a regular meeting at Block Cafe and Price Hill, and we're going to be inviting people to and grow our ranks and get more coalitions, build a coalition, and then try to visit city council members and introduce them to what we have as a Bill of Rights, see how that goes. Probably need to have a petition and so on. So those are our plans for the future. So we hope you will join us.
Actually, not too far in the future, Jean. May 7th, the first Saturday, we have these Block Cafe and Price Hill meetings on the first Saturday of the month.
Oh, great, Susan, thank you. We also have a booth at Earth Day.
11:30 at Block Cafe, first Saturday.
Great. So do we have a little time now for some questions from our audience? We have Jessica Schultz and I think Susan Bonner. We're going to look at the chat and see what questions there are, and maybe we can address some of those questions now.
Yeah, so hi, everybody. I think we'll start off maybe with the first question being in places where rights of nature have already passed, what are examples of applying this regulation successfully to prevent or stop a specific harmful practice?
It looks like a question for Tish.
Okay. One of the things I always say, because this question always comes up every single time we talk about rights of nature, and another mind shift that we have to get our heads out of, I guess, and switch our thinking on is this whole idea of what's a win, what's a loss. Because in the current system, we view things if it wins, like, so for example, I'll use the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. As Bill mentioned, it passed. It was over 60% of the voters voted for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And then within 12 hours, an industrial corporate entity sued to have it overturned, even though they weren't even in the city of Toledo. And if people know the story at all, it took over a year, but it was the courts backed up the polluter. The state of Ohio joined on the state of the polluter, and so they lost. So in traditional sense, in our way of thinking, we would say that's a loss. However, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights garnered immense attention, not just in Ohio, across the country and even internationally. And it opened up so many minds to the idea of rights of nature. They'd never even heard of it before. So I consider that a win. And so we have to think of past movements because we do consider this a movement. This is different than just getting an ordinance passed to, handle a specific, project or something within your community. This is a part of being part of a much greater movement. And we know from movements in the past, they don't happen overnight. And so you always have, cases where the firsts, and that was the first, as Bill mentioned, in the United States, where it may not be successful. But in my mind, it was a great win because it did open so many more minds to the idea of rights of nature. Cincinnati would not even be doing this probably if it wasn't for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. So back to that, unfortunately, in this country, we don't have a lot of specific examples of the wins like that in traditional sense. But I mentioned two cases in Ecuador, which they passed that in their put that in their constitution in 2008, and they now have had in 2022. So it's taken a while. Some of the first court cases, and it's taken, obviously courts there are just as slow as here, but there have been two successful decisions in favor of nature. In the Vilcabamba River case, that was the city was doing something to the river, a road project, and they were changing the flow of the river. And so people sued on behalf of the river, and the court said the city had to stop the project and put the river back to how it was. And then the Los Cedros is a forest in Ecuador, and there was a mining project that wants to proceed in that area, and the court ruled in favor of the forest. And of course, you know, they're expecting an appeal. I haven't followed. I'm sure the mining company has probably appealed, so we don't know what will be the end effect. But again, the point of all this is that they got to go to court, and they got to make the cases on both of these pros, cons. What's it going to do to nature? How is this going to affect not just the people, but nature itself? And so that's what we're trying to get to.
Tish, I'd like to interject. Didn't recently the EPA come out and say they were going to work a lot harder on Lake Erie now? Didn't they make some promises just very recently about, I mean, it's kind of like the consolation prize. Like, we heard you, Toledo. We need to protect the lake more. There was just some.
Well, they do. Yeah, they do that all the time. I mean, Lake Erie was actually declared dead once already. So, and then they they dot their I's and cross their T's and all that for a while. And that's again to keep the illusion going that people feel they're protected. So they don't, oh, the EPA's handling it now, we don't have to do anything. And then we wind up back in the exact same place. But the thing is that idea that if they really wanted to do something, we know in Lake Erie that it's a lot of factory farms, and if they wouldn't issue any more permits to allow any more, but they still do. So that's how you know that it doesn't mean anything. They're just blowing smoke again.
Yeah, and on that same note, and the regulatory fallacy, it's the Department of Agriculture now that's issuing permits for factory farms. The Ohio EPA has stepped out of it altogether. We have no idea how many factory farms there are around, Northwest Ohio in particular.
We have another question.
Yes, we have another question that I think if Jerry is still with us, I'd like to direct in his direction. How can we shift from the idea that nature belongs to us to the idea that we belong to nature? Is Jerry still here with us?
I don't think so. He said he had to go.
I see. Okay.
Okay, I'll ask him. So,
Let's see. So we have a series of questions, and I think that we've touched on these, but perhaps it's just worth kind of summing up again. The series of questions was things like, well, we hear about plastics in water. Are there efforts to replant trees? The EPA was cleaning up acid rain in the Great Lakes. There's brownfield issues. There are all of these sort of individual issues. But how can rights of nature help us to address each of these?
I'll start, and then Tish, I know you can follow up, because this is what you're always saying to us. Let's get off the hamster wheel. Let's stop the whack-a-mole game, trying to stop something here, stop something there, and exhaust our effort with these single issues, where if we bring rights of nature forth, we can just protect the ecosystem. There's legal standing in court. We can stop the harms legally.
Yeah, that was really good, Susan. You're right. I mean, I touched on that a little, and again, because it was so quick, but instead of fighting the plastics and fighting this, if all the people could work together to get rights for the Ohio River watershed, you could then bring, and if once you read the bill, there's an ecosystem advocate, you can go to that, and that ecosystem advocate who's speaking for the river, you don't have to wait for the harm to happen. I mean, one, you can stop things obviously that are happening, but say a new project is proposed that is going to violate the rights of the river. Its right to thrive, to exist, to flourish. So preemptively, you can bring that to court and say, this is going to, and now again, we don't know what will happen. It's not like this is dismantling the whole system. Right now, the nature's, the violations of those rights can be brought. There can be evidence brought. There can be all kinds of data and statistics that can be brought to the court to at least look at. Currently, you don't have that. And I know for my own community, we tried many times. The judges said we didn't have standing. The way it works in our current system is unless you own property along that ecosystem or that river or whatever it is you want to protect, the court will say you don't have standing to even bring a case. So you can't even get into the courtroom to make the case that the rights will be violated or that your rights will be violated to clean air and clean water. That's the other part of the Bill of Rights. It's not just nature's rights, it's again putting in rights of the people to a healthy and clean environment and to be free from toxic trespass and all those things. So there's additional rights for humans within the Ohio River Bill of Rights watershed as well. And there was in the Lake Erie one.
Thank you both. So shifting gears slightly, the question is, so what exactly do you want folks in Cincinnati to do to improve the water quality in the Ohio River? Or to help protect the Ohio River?
Can I say something here? This is the same thing we just talked about. It's a particular, what we're trying to do is get the whole idea that coming from this whole new worldview of nature having rights as being a living community that we're members of, not owners of, that we try to pass a law under which then any chemical violation or pollution about to happen, already happening, can be prosecuted. Just like Tish just said, we're trying to avoid the whack-a-mole approach and change the law so that we can get standing in court and represent nature and giving it the standing it deserves in court.
Yeah. It's easier for corporations to prove damages to their company for loss of profits than it is for us to prove damages for an expansion of Rumpke, for example, into communities. Where's the damages, they will say, and there isn't anyone yet, and it takes a long time to prove that. So since there's no basis of rights for protection of that community, we aren't on equal standing with Rumpke to defend their rights to a clean community.
Right. They use those corporate rights and preemption to stamp on us. They take away our rights. So you're drinking polluted water, I'm drinking polluted water, and all that, because their rights supersede ours. Their rights to, and in our community, it was actually the permit. They said by denying, we took a vote in our community. 67% of the people, again, wanted to keep the urban drilling that was happening out. And they went to court, 2 drillers, again, who didn't live in the community. And they said their rights were being violated and their property rights because they had permits from the state, which legalized the harm they wanted to do in our backyards. We had no way to stop it. So again, and I know it's really a difficult concept because we are so propagandized to believe that the system, the way it is the only way it can be. So it's very difficult sometimes for us to imagine something else. Think of it like other rights movements. So, with civil rights, let's say in the 60s, you had to first have the rights, or even with slaves, let's say they were property. And they needed to have their rights recognized first under our system. Like, that's what I said, our system isn't necessarily the best way. I mean, it's what we know, but it may not be the best way. And yet you had to first get the rights recognized before you can go forward and say the rights are being violated. And that's where nature finds itself right now. Nature has no rights. It's only property. So it can be abused, exploited, whatever, by the owner. And so the owner doesn't have to consider the impact it has on other people in the community or the other species that are within that ecosystem that may be destroyed because they don't exist. They're invisible. in the law the way it is now. So that's what we're trying to shift. Do we have all the answers and know exactly what will happen with every single case? No, but someone I saw in chat said, well, you know, what about, I don't know, some project, or is it sewer or whatever in Cincinnati? Well, if you had the rights, the people could get into court to say that, yes, that project the city's doing, just like the Vilcabamba River one, is violating the rights of the river. And then it goes to court. I can't predict what, you know, evidence will be presented, what a judge will decide, but right now you can't do that.
Thanks, Tish. I want to just draw attention to the Ohio River Bill of Rights sections that are up on the screen. If people are very curious what we're exactly proposing, it's a, you know, new system of ecosystem advocacy, and that there'd be an advisory commission, and there are certain powers and responsibilities, and there's procedures for enforcing this, and an ecology court, and a way to, you know, correct if the ecosystem advocate is not doing what we, you know, set out to, you know, do, protect the ecosystem, right? That they not have the economic will at the forefront, that it is the ecosystem itself. And so it discusses the qualifications of people that might be appointed for that. And yeah, you know, another thing that keeps coming over and over in my mind is this, you know, 250 years of laws, they've legal precedents in our court that have been protecting this property. And that's what the next legal decision is made based on the former precedents, which is protecting property. And that's why it's got, you know, something's got to give, something's got to change. You know, the law has to change.
What I learned from democracy school discussions was that our economy prevails. The rights of our economy to exist prevails over the rights of people, and that seems to be the real standoff at the bottom of all this. So I mean, that's in the decision-making process. We do have to protect, you know, money and corporate profits. People forget them. Other questions?
Yes. So so far, is there any court in the U.S. that has enforced the rights of enforced a rights of nature ruling?
Yeah, those were the Ecuadorian ones that I mentioned. Those were those courts. There's been other ones. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, I keep coming back to it, but it's probably the most prominent one in the United States. But I was in the courtroom the day when the case was argued in federal court over almost an hour. The rights of Lake Erie were discussed in a federal courtroom and argued. And so that was history in the making. And a lot of times, again, I think we're so anxious that we want like this win. What do we define a win? And if it's not that, then we all put it down and go, oh, that didn't work. And then we give up and are off to something or go back to the system the way it is. And it's like, that's what we can't do. We have to have more and more communities because that's how the change will happen. It's how every single change, expanding rights has ever happened. So you don't give up. You go, the next community has to do it and take what Toledo did and move it further. And that's what I see Cincinnati doing. There's other communities in the United States. Tomorrow is actually a hearing in about the Grant Township case, which has been going on for many years in Pennsylvania. That's happening in Harrisburg tomorrow. And the EPA in that case actually sued the community of Grant Township for trying to protect their environment. So think about that. The Environmental Protection Agency sued the community for trying to protect their environment with the rights of nature law.
You know, several years ago in Colorado, Longmont, Colorado, the city of Longmont passed a law against fracking. The next day they were sued, not by a fracking corporation, but by the governor of Colorado, Governor Hickenlooper. That just shows you this is not atypical, that state governments especially are really much more loyal and advocates for corporations than for local communities or the natural world.
Yeah,
And we have the stories. We just put together a book. It's called Death by Democracy. And it's actually the stories of 7 Ohio communities who've been trying to pursue this avenue of rights of nature. They all had rights of nature in the bills, but you'll see, and the reason it's called Death by Democracy, because what the people realized in the end, it wasn't necessarily the corporations, it was their own government, both the administrative branch, so the governor and the secretary of state keeping their issues off the ballot, or it was the legislative branch passing preemptive laws, stopping them from trying to pass their own rights, laws in their community protecting nature. And then finally, the judicial branch. So the people said, it's our own government that's in our way. So yeah, if you want, there's going to be in chat, I think they're putting in the link to the book, but it's called Death by Democracy, and you can get it on ebook or an actual paperback copy.
Tish, what are the signs of progress? You say when these agricultural firms fight back and sue your efforts in Toledo, you take that as a good sign because they seem like they're afraid of you or something. Do you see that as progress?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's like when it just sits there and nobody touches it and uses it, then they're just words on paper. We need that conflict because that creates the discussions and the debates and the arguments, and where we'll finally, if we have enough of those, that something will change. So yeah, those are definitely, I think of the Gandhi quote always, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you. So I look at it, we're in the then they fight you stage, and then the last one is then you win. So, I mean, I'm pretty happy.
Right. Well, right here in Cincinnati, we have this Rumpke Waste District, and they're sponsoring the Earth Day this year, and they don't want a group of the community people to have a booth at the Earth Day because they're in opposition. So there's a little bit of, and we're just wondering, well, is Rumpke afraid of people? I just want to see that as maybe a good sign, not a bad sign.
Well, and they think they own the community. That's the thing. Whose community is it? Is it you people who live in Cincinnati, or is it Rumpke's community? We saw this all over Pennsylvania and all that. They put up a slide. They talk about it because they sponsor a community event. It's their community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Wasn't there something very interesting in that Lake Erie Bill of Rights case, Tish? On one hand, the judge said this law doesn't have enough teeth. Where is the, it's useless. There's nothing defined in this Bill of Rights. And then on the other side of his mouth, he's like, this has caused harm to this industry and is threatening our livelihood of productivity and economic growth. And it's like, oh, so this law that's useless is threatening the industry. How does that work?
Exactly. Yeah, it was actually the lawyers for the state of Ohio and for the Dravis Farms. On one hand, they were saying, oh, it's just aspirational language and blah, blah, blah. And then the further part of their argument, it was like, well, this is going to definitely do harm to us. Well, it's like, which is it? I mean, either it's just aspirational poetry language or you're afraid it can do harm. So
if you want to see the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, you can go to lakeerieaction.org, I think it is. The whole thing is on there. It's much shorter than our Bill of Rights.
That's because your Bill of Rights, now we've expanded the enforcement because people keep saying, well, how's this going to work? We just have the rights in it. And we think it's moved far enough along that now we're getting very specific to show people what enforcement could look like.
I realize how strange this whole approach and movement first seems to traditional environmentalists, even until the thing that convinced me 10 years ago when I was first learning about CELDF and the rights of nature movement, community rights, was reading the cases and examples in community after community, especially in Pennsylvania in the beginning, of how they started out trying to enforce permits and so forth and go within the traditional system, and it was not working. And then when they started passing bills of rights for communities and eventually for ecosystems themselves, the kind of pushback they got from the state, not just from corporations, was remarkable. And it just shows how much we've lost, how much of democracy we're really losing.
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our hour. I'm just wondering, maybe we have just take one more question and then we can close the evening. Do we have another question, Jessica?
Yes. So I think we don't have Jerry with us, but I think Tish touched on this in the comments, and I feel strongly that maybe we should just touch on this again. Someone asked, does the EPA have an environmental justice wing that works with Native Americans and Indigenous communities?
I don't know anything specifically about that. Susan might. I did know they invited me and I did participate. They did some kind of an environmental justice academy, and they invited me to speak on one of them. It goes on, I think, like for 9 months. It was once a month that they did this. So I know they obviously are concerned somehow about environmental justice, but.
Right, and of course, there's a whole division of tribal law with the federal government as well. And, you know, environmental questions traditionally have gone under just the tribal law and those great treaties, wonderful treaties that we honor so well, right? So.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, in case people missed it too, Jerry had put in the chat about, you know, consent not being the same as consultation. So consultation with tribes is one thing, and giving consent is something totally different. And I put in the chat, if you didn't see it, it's like our hearings, right? Where Susan, I think, mentioned that. So you can go to a hearing and make your comments, but the EPA or whatever, the government agency, doesn't have to take those comments into account when they make their final decision. So there's a real similarity there, how the system works, the same. So yeah, consult you, and you may not like what we're going to do, but we're not going to give you final consent.
Okay. Russ Doyle, you had your hand up. I wondered if you still have your question. I think we'll have to stop it here. So I just want to thank everybody for this great program. Thank Women's City Club for having us. Thank Crow for presenting, and Tish for being here, and Jerry Neri and Susan. All your presentations been wonderful, and your participation, audience. Thank you so much. I just wanted to tell you that all your registrants to this program will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of tonight's program. We will also have the notes from the chat and so on available. I want to remind people to join us at Crow. We're going to be, as of first Saturday of May, we're going to meet at the Price Hill Incline District in the Block Coffee House for an hour at 11:30 in the morning. And we also invite you to come to our Earth Day booth, celebrating this year's theme appropriately, water and the ripple effect for protection. So thank you again for being here. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Jean.
Right. Thank you, Beth.
And everybody become a member of Women's City Club.
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely. Great organization, a leading organization, and a nice environmental group too.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
After the meeting, the Crow meeting on the Saturday, we're going to be doing a workshop, the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition and Muse, with Lila June on Indigenous traditional agricultural practices at the McKee Center. So I encourage you to stop by and listen to a Native American community activist talk about this.
Thank you, Diana. That should be a great program. Coming.